All right. Okay, well, let's kick her off. Zoom link is out there, so cool. It's Friday. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy afternoon to those on the East Coast. And good morning to those that are still on coffee time. Cool. Day 5. I hope that this week has been good for everybody, and there's a great agenda today as well. I'm excited to kick off the Resiliency panel with Sara, Lynn, and Lauren. Humbled to be here. I know Erin grabbed me a couple weeks ago and said, I need you to come and moderate this panel. I've now turned into the moderator on panels, and I absolutely love it, mostly because I just do one of these during the conversation, and it's nice to ask questions and be a part of it. So super happy to be here. I am going to try very hard not to talk much, but those of you that know me know I'm quite the loudmouth and rambler. So I'm going to try really hard to stay on mute. With that, we'll get into some introductions. But I think first and foremost, to intro the next hour and a half a little bit. So why are we here? Well, resiliency is the theme of the panel today. Why? Well, as a team lead and as future team leads for most of you, being resilient, understanding what that means for yourself personally, how to build that within your team, how to build that throughout the organization, continually adapting to challenges, understanding what that means, and building up that confidence within the experience, within your experiences, is really key to the day-to-day without, so that you don't lose your mind. Because nothing ever goes as planned, no matter how much you try to plan to make it go right. So it's about building that up within yourself and making sure that you're vocalizing that within your team. So we're going to go through a number of questions, not only how to kind of guide yourself through that personal journey of building out resilience, but also how to build that within your team and throughout the organization. So I'm going to let Sara, Lynn, and Lauren introduce themselves and talk about a brief description of their journey towards today and how, they've come to where they are within being their own team leads within their organizations, but a small brief journey on their resiliency path too, and then we'll get into questions. With that said, please ask any and all questions in the Zoom chat throughout the session today. I'll be grabbing the best ones, well, most of them, and if it makes sense within the specific topic, then I'll kind of bust in and ask your question as it kind of guides us through the conversation. If not, there's going to be time afterwards, so we'll make sure that we get all of your questions asked. So throw them in as you see fit. So with that, Sara, why don't you kick us off and give us a little introduction of who you are and where you work and what you think of resiliency.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Joanne, and thank you to this group for having me this morning. It's a real honor to be able to spend a couple hours with you, or an hour and a half with you this morning. And resilience is absolutely one of the most important tools in your toolbox as a leader and aspiring leader, and even as a responsible colleague. So I have a lot of stories for you today, but a little bit about where I've come from. So my profession is delivery. I'm a professional executor of other people's ideas. So it's basically my kind of last senior job in this role was at Auto Trader, working alongside with Lynn for quite a few years. A fairly aggressive, male-dominated space. And what we did there was we sold cars online. And I worked there for probably 10 to 12 years. And I worked my way up from leading projects to leading programs of work to leading groups of other leaders, to ending my career there last year as their VP of product and software delivery. So really delivering out all of the kind of products that we were using for the consumer-facing website, as well as products that we were delivering to our car dealers. who are our main customers. Along the way, I've had lots of opportunity to strengthen my resilience as a tool set. So lots of stories I can share with you guys today, some anecdotes and hopefully some good advice. Additionally, like right now, what I'm doing is I'm working at Electronic Arts, my first stint in gaming, which I've only been there for 7 weeks, and as a development director of FIFA. So I'm pretty excited to be there. And I've spent a bit of time learning some e-commerce at a local shop called Kit Nace. I built the e-commerce platform for them back in 2015, 2016, when they were looking to kind of expand very quickly and they didn't have a platform. So I left to do that, left AutoTrader to do that, came back to AutoTrader and said, let's sell some cars online. And it didn't work out, but that's okay. And yeah, that's where I am today. So.
Thank you, Sarah. Lauren, kick her off.
Oh gosh, I feel a little less prepared after that intro there from Sarah. Lots of good experience there. You know, I think what I'll be able to add to this particular conversation is more on the IQ front of like kind of my experience from IQ metrics, being a lead and growing here at IQ, and kind of how that journey has gone and where I've seen resiliency really tie in to you know, IQ's success as a whole, because we have lots of change happen. So I'm excited to kind of plug in there as we run through the questions. But as far as my background goes, hopefully a lot of you know my background, but I'll maybe start a little further back than I normally do. My first role in leadership was actually at 16 at my first job. I started there at 14 and then became a manager at 16 at a birthday party fun center, which is probably the reason I do not have children. And I worked there for 7 years. And I learned a lot managing people that were, you know, 14, 15, 16, you know, my age. And then after that, in college, switched to working at a cell phone retailer, selling phones, which was a nice change. Very different people I was interacting with. And I, after college, got a job in their administration as an accountant with a marketing degree, which was super, super interesting. But I very quickly, because I had the sales side knowledge and I actually knew RQ really well, that's what we used in the stores, ended up in a lead role. I think within like 6 months, I had a team of 3. And again, a new experience, doing systems integrations between RQ and our finance software, and implementing an ERP as my last project there. Again, interesting experience. I was on my team, I think there was the age gap between me and the other person, the next closest person on my team was like 20 years. So that was an interesting experience of learning that I didn't know a lot of things very quickly, especially about leadership and growth and things I needed to learn about myself. At that point, I thought I knew everything. So during that whole time, I decided I really liked this systems thing. So I went back to college and got a master's in applied information technology, which essentially is take one really tiny coding class to prove you kind of get the concepts, which I'm impressed I passed, and then learn a lot about like systems management and how to launch software, and kind of like manage all of the pieces. And then at that point, I decided let's take a jump. And there just happened to be a role posted in Davidson, which I was living in Maryland at the time. That's where I'd grown up my entire life. And I decided to take the leap at IQ and apply, and I got the job and moved 2 months later. And I've had, I don't know how many roles at IQ, a lot. I've been here 4-ish years, 4.5 years maybe. And I think I've held like 5 different roles in that time. It's just kind of wherever the need was, I just kind of like flowed into it and just tried to, you know, figure out where I could could apply best. But definitely I found my fit in product management. I really feel like I found the role that is where I want to spend my career. I really enjoy figuring out what to build and you know, then letting other people figure out how to execute on that. So yeah, I think that's it for me.
Perfect. Thanks, Lauren. Lynn.
Excellent. Hi, good morning. I'll echo saying thank you so much for inviting us to come speak with you today. Resiliency is one of my favorite topics. It's actually an attribute that at AutoTrader, we actually found an assessment instrument. And for somebody to come in and be hired, particularly at a director or executive level, we actually administered this instrument to assess their resiliency and resolve, because as Sara indicated, it was a very aggressive business. It's kind of an aggressive industry when you're selling to car dealers. If anyone who's ever had to go onto a dealership lot and buy a car, you can imagine now you're selling to these people, you know, and very high performing, very driven organizations. So, you know, you could not be successful in that organization without a high level of resiliency and a high level of resolve. Maybe I'll start. Currently, I'm self-employed. So I operate as a human resources consultant, and I work with a variety of companies in the lower mainland of British Columbia right now. The majority of my work is with a private equity firm. So I give human resources advice to that firm, and I also support some of the companies within their portfolio. And one that I'm working most regularly with right now is called Clarius Mobile Health. They've invented this very cool handheld wireless ultrasound, which just boggles my mind, the brilliant things that we have in our backyard and don't even know about. You know, maybe I'll start off at the start of my career. I was kind of chuckling to myself because I think the start of my career is probably the last thing you'd expect of somebody who ends up leading HR in any kind of tech company, which is when I graduated from university with a Bachelor of Commerce. I started my career doing labor relations at what is now called Coast Mountain Bus Company. So I was 25 years old, and this was a highly male-dominated, and every leader that I worked with was a male at least 20 years older than me. And it was my job to come in and manage conflicts between managers and the union, or managers and employees, and sometimes to anticipate conflicts. And my job also required me at times to stand in front of somebody that was, you know, 2, 3, 4 steps above me in the hierarchy and say, no, you can't do that. This is the action you need to take now. So a lot of the skills I developed in terms of communication, in terms of being very comfortable standing in front of somebody or standing in a conflict, really come from that background. I spent 4 years there and then moved to, and in my career, I then took, you know, gradually more senior roles and more general or broader HR roles. The last 14 years of my employed career were with AutoTrader. And that organization, I think, is also a great example of resilience. So when I started with the company in 2003, it was a print-based company. Probably 5% of our revenue came from online. We did have a website, but it was predominantly print. We were privately owned at the time, but within 3 years, we were sold to Yellow Pages, which was a publicly held company. And so we had to shift very quickly to get used to chasing quarterly earnings. And at the same time, seeing the influx of digital technology and watch our print revenue slowly decline. I joined the leadership team in 2009 while we were owned by Yellow Pages. And that was a really eye-opening experience. The trap you can be in when you're chasing quarterly earnings, you're facing intense competition, the industry is shifting underneath you, and we actually called it death by 1,000 paper cuts. You're seeing your revenue decline, and you're just focusing on making cost saving, introducing cost saving measures to stay afloat. it was extremely stressful. And, you know, one of the positive things at the end of the day that happened for the organization and brand is the Yellow Pages decided to carve out the auto side of the business. Prior to that, we had other verticals in boats, general, and real estate. And they carved out the auto side of the business, and that's become what is autotrader.ca today. So a private equity company bought that group, and they did it with the investment thesis that with some additional investment and being out from under chasing quarterly earnings, we could finally eliminate the print product and we would turn the business around. And if you actually see the business plan, it went, revenue is going to go like this, and then it's going to turn and come back up. And I think that is probably one of the most crazy experiences I've had living through that. And I may talk a bit more about that journey later, but the end result was we ended up selling the business 4 years later. As a member of the executive team, I had a tiny little share of it, and it allowed me to then leave employment and do the consulting work I'm doing now.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Lynn. Appreciate it. All right, team, let's go into the first bucket of owning your own resiliency. So again, our journey today is going to be kind of your own personal story around resiliency and examples and what that means and how you can provide advice for people to kind of get there and understand what their own story is. To then how do you build that within your team and your organization? So Lynn, why don't you kick us off? You've spoken a lot in past conversations the last few weeks around owning your own style and owning your own strength. Talk to us what you mean by that and how you came to understand truly what your own style and what your own strength was.
Yeah, and I'll say, you know, I think it's something to know what you're comfortable with and what you're not. And I probably realized that a bit more when I was leading a team and I was coaching others. And people would say, well, I can't do what you do. And the first time I couldn't understand that. Of course you can. You know, I do it, so you can. But there really is something about, you know, people innately have differences in their natural style. Some people are very comfortable speaking very directly. Some people prefer to be, you know, more subtle, more, you know, sensitive in their eyes, I think more respectful of other people. And so one thing I've done over the course of my career is really spend a lot of time watching what other people do, seeing how other people handle particular circumstances, how they phrase things, you know, when they choose action and when they choose inaction. I actually find some of the more powerful, you know, tactics are silence or not moving forward, particularly if somebody's, you know, trying to subtly pressure you to take action. And that's how I really developed my style. So, you know, I've had a lot of people say to me, you know, you're quite direct and, you know, it can make me uncomfortable. And, you know, I've at various times I've struggled with that as a leader. You know, am I, particularly being the head of HR, there's sort of this idea of, you know, who you should be, you know, the stereotypical view of kind of a bubbly person, and that is not my personality. But I do care very deeply. So I had to find a way to let people know I cared. But I wasn't going to apologize for who I am. You know, I have something to offer, and if you don't want that, that's okay. I'll go help these other people. I think the other thing, I was thinking about this a bit more, and we didn't talk about it in our previous call, but you know, one of the other areas that I think I struggled with at one point in my career was, you know, being a mother, being a working mother, and some of the comments that I would get. You know, I have 3 children. And when they were young, I had quite a big job and I was traveling a lot. And I would get a lot of comments, sadly, mostly from women, when I would be in Toronto, saying, you know, how can you do this? I'm in awe that you can do this job. And who's looking after your children? You know, or my favorite was when I actually made it home from a long day in Toronto, a flight home, made it out to the soccer mom drinks because it was important to my kids that I go there. And after a couple of glasses of wine, the woman next to me looked over and said, I saw your children yesterday and I'm just amazed at how well adjusted they are. And I just thought, really? And it, at the time, and there's certainly been times that I've suffered from, the mom guilt. But I always come back to, I know that I'm a better person. I'm happier. I'm good at what I do. And I believe I have a good impact on people. And so I just have chosen over the years to interpret those comments as they're poorly worded compliments, or they say more about the other person than they do about me.
Poorly worded compliments. We'll come back to that later. Lauren, one of the comments that Lynn talked about in terms of being very assertive or very black and white obviously rings true to your personality, and those that work with you I think can attest to that. But I think it was very interesting, you were making a comment around this a couple days ago, and how you feel one way, but it's almost like it's perceived something different. So talk us through kind of that journey along those lines.
You think I'm blunt and assertive? I am so shocked that you feel that way. Yeah, actually, that's something I've really struggled with throughout my whole career, not just as a lead, more so when it was a lead, because I think you end up developing deeper relationships with people, but overall with, I'll get a lot of people take my bluntness as, she's just not a nice word potentially, or she just doesn't care, or she's mean, or these different things, and things that I don't I don't care that it's going to upset people. And what's actually pretty ironic, anyone who has been my lead can probably attest to this, but I actually very much agonize over situations where I know I'm going to have to provide feedback or say something that is going to upset people, or that I know they're not going to take well. But it's something that I've come to. I've actually thought a lot, and when I've had mentors talk to them about should I change this about myself? Should I not be as direct? And it's one of those things that I've really decided it is who I am. I am a blunt person, but I do really care. And I put a lot of thought into those conversations, and I, it personally, the only way I can describe it is turmoil. I pace and I stress and I agonize and I go over the conversation for sometimes days. But in the end, I truly believe that being honest with people is, and just direct and straight is actually the best thing overall. I'm always trying to work on my delivery. It's something, again, with every mentor I've had, I work on kind of how I deliver things to try and, be as empathetic as possible. But it's not one of my strengths, and it's something I spend a lot of time working on. It may not be obvious to people because some people are just so much better at it innately. And I think sometimes because I am, a woman, people assume, they expect more empathy than I'm just naturally good at. But it's something I'm working on. But yeah, I really just believe that being blunt and honest, that's part of my style. That is who I am, and it's not something I'm willing to compromise. So one of the things I've kind of learned over time is, when I'm interviewing someone for a job, I'm quite transparent about that up front and about my style, and, talking to them about how they like, to be managed, and making sure that they're really comfortable with, that kind of style. And just opening it up to if I ever offend you or hurt your feelings, or you want to talk about it, I want to talk about it. So please reach out. So just trying to put it out there up front and start with that before someone's worked with me, I found can sometimes give them the opportunity when I say something that comes across really blunt to be oh, maybe she didn't mean it the way that it came across, and then we can have a conversation about how I could have done that better. So
thank you for sharing that. I think what was important was understanding that the change over kind of starting in the role that you did and then moving into more of a team lead role and understanding that journey and knowing more about yourself. And that's what this last 5 days is meant to be, right? Is understanding those certain things about yourself in order to kind of drive who you want to be moving forward and what that really looks like.
Yeah.
Sara, one of the things that you said on one of our calls has really stuck with me, and I'm hoping you can kind of expand a little bit of resiliency. What does that mean? Work hard and know your shit is really what that means. And I laughed pretty hard when you said it that day, and I wonder if you can kind of take us through that and what that's meant for you in your career.
Yeah, it's so I would say that my style has evolved obviously over time and with my experience and as you grow your career and grow into a new role, and I have had to own multiple different styles until I found what suited me. But what I will say is that I've always grounded my my work and my leadership and everything that I do in the fact that I just work really hard. So I work really hard. I get a lot of things done. Part of my role that I've always had has been to lead people without authority. So being somebody who is a delivery person, these people don't report to you, and you often find yourself leading groups of people that are of different they're different experience levels. So you've got some very senior people in the room, you've got some junior people in the room. Often they're of different disciplines. So, you know, when you're doing cross-functional project leadership or big transformational change in an organization, you've often got people from the technology group, you've got people from sales, you've got marketing sitting over there in the corner, finance. So you know, you're often well, you're very rarely ever left with authority, but you still have to lead all of these people. So early in my career, I found that it was like you were always going into a room and I would be prepared for war. And part of this was actually my boss at the time. You know, we would go into something that was honestly, it was like a disagreement with a neighbor about lawn cutting. And he would have prepared me to go in for an absolute war. Like the level of preparation that we would undertake to get into that room prepared me for almost any situation. And I always remember thinking, oh, this is overkill. This is overkill. We don't have to do it. He was right every time. He was right all the time. What I took away from that was my resiliency became grounded very early in the idea that I might actually just know more about this than a lot of other people. And while I'm not shouting out about that, and while I'm not, and I'm not sitting there bragging at the table saying, I know more than you, the fact is that you'd have to get up pretty early to outmaneuver somebody who prepped for war to go in for a conversation with your neighbor about lawn cutting. So you'd have to work really hard to sort of get around that. So sort of early on at AutoTrader, I realized this was actually going to be my secret weapon. My secret weapon was going to be that I am going to spend more time and more energy and more effort in knowing my shit and making sure that I work really hard. And just as Lynn was kind of describing the transformation that took place, I was actually one of the people hired on in 2006 to build up the website, because like she's saying, there was only a print business there. And the conversations that I had when I came into my interview were around the online space. I was super young. I didn't know anything about print magazines, couldn't care less about them. I knew only about the internet and the awesome things that were going to happen in 2006. I had a Facebook account. Nobody else had that. We were like, it was like 2005, 2006 maybe. And so we were talking about how amazing all of these things were. You know, we were playing zombie wars and things like that. And I remember sitting down there and them giving me a project that basically said, yeah, you're actually going to have to make this website, and you're going to have to go across Canada and talk to all of these salespeople about how they're going to have to sell to a car dealer, but they're going to have to sell space on a web page instead of space in a magazine. And I kind of looked at them, I'm like, what do you mean sell space on the web page? Like, are you talking about a banner ad? Because that's not cool. But maybe that's where we were at in that first early days. And I remember going across Canada with one of my colleagues, and we had done kind of groundbreaking stuff at the time in terms of our usability testing and our ability to test our kind of UX and IA. And we were, at that point, we didn't have all the tools that we have now to be able to test that. So we had to it was pretty old school with the eye tracking and whatnot to see that our designs were really solid. And so we went across Canada, and our job was to present the new design of this website to everybody. And we had, you can imagine, and honestly, like Lynn's job in this project was probably much harder than mine was, because I knew the technology I was pitching. I knew that the web design was fine. I knew everything was going to be okay, and I knew how to build a website. So we were good. But what I wasn't realizing at the time was that every time I went into a room, I was sitting across the table from a salesperson who had probably been with AutoTrader for, I don't know, maybe a decade of their life, maybe more, selling to used car dealers. So that's not an easy task. Selling to used car dealers, the idea that they had to be in this magazine. And I would show them this beautiful web page, and I'd be like, oh, this is amazing, and you know, all these people are going to come to it. And I would tell them, this is the future. Like, how can you not understand this is the future? Mm-hmm. And I didn't realize at that time how hard that was for them to accept. And I remember this one guy in Toronto asking me if I did my usability testing in Toronto. And I said, no, what do you mean? Did I do it in Toronto? No, we did all this work in Vancouver. Well, I'm pretty sure that people use the internet differently in Toronto. And I said, no, I'm pretty sure they don't. But at the time, I remember thinking, I don't know yet how to deal with this. And it's been a learning process over time to learn how to deal with that kind of fronting when somebody is sort of giving you something it seems illogical to you, but you have to be able to respond to it. And I've always been able to be successful in my projects. Oh, sorry, I should never say that. I've had terrible failed projects, but I've been able to be successful in my own style because I ground myself always in what I know. And now, as I get more experienced, or I'm older, or I'm more advanced in my career, I'm also actually quite able to admit when I don't know something. Mm-hmm. And that transformation has been significant in terms of me moving up ranks. I don't think I would have been a VP if I hadn't been able to admit when I don't know something. If you had just been the person touting that you're so smart, you know everything, I don't think I would have been recognized at that level. So that's been a real adjustment as well in my career.
Appreciate that, Sarah. And I think that's really interesting because it rolls into how you manage, interpret, react to things in general. And Lynn, back to your poorly worded compliments email, that's such a big part of, and it doesn't seem like it, but it's such a huge part of having resiliency of who you are and being confident in that. Kind of open it up to all three of you. When you think about managing and interpreting and reacting to things, good or bad, talk us through kind of that effort and that work to get through that.
I was chuckling when Sarah was talking about this last concept of the ability to acknowledge what you don't know. And I think that really is key. And I saw the same as I moved up the ranks. And one of the things that I'm always an observer. I'm always watching what people are doing and how they're doing it. And there's a point in your career where you feel like you need to show up and have all the answers and have it all packaged perfectly. And what I realized at a certain point was, the directors, and particularly the VPs I was working with, they didn't have all the information. And in fact, they didn't want all the information from me. And I would get very frustrated. Like, I've got all the detail here. And be like, no, just give me the Coles notes. It's like, how can, you're irresponsible. I would get so frustrated with them. And, it occurred to me, well, of course they can't. They're dealing with so many things. They have so many decisions to make. And they get comfortable. And I had to learn how to get comfortable dealing with a huge scope, having to make a lot of decisions very quickly with incomplete and sometimes inaccurate information, which meant I was going to make mistakes. And so when I left Auto Trader, one of the women that worked for me gave me a card of the 10 lessons she learned from Lynn. And one of the points was, mistakes are just mistakes. Get over it, right? You learn from it, but if you think you can go through your career and not make mistakes, you're fooling yourself and you haven't taken enough chances. And you haven't really owned what you need to own. So I think that capacity to recognize, this is what I know, this is what I don't, and I'm prepared for somebody else to be the authority on this and to inform and change my decision. And I'm prepared to make the call and be wrong, because that's what I need to do as a leader. I can't put that on anyone else.
Lauren, Sarah, any other comments on that reaction and how to interact back with that?
I was laughing during that because there's been a lot of conversation, which probably a lot of people who are on the call have heard recently, around how can we move faster? And one of the realities in product is that many things we build are going to fail, right? Like, we're going to kill more products, probably, especially as we start to get more inventive or innovate more, than are going to succeed. But I think what's one of the things we've been talking about that's been stalling us recently is wanting, and one of the things I struggle with is wanting enough information to be right, and be sure that it's the right thing, and just working on how to evolve that. So it's not something I don't know that I can provide much advice on, but it's interesting, that conversation of how do you find that balance of feeling like enough to make a decision and just making the decision and being okay internally that maybe you're going to be wrong and you're going to have to own that. So
I think one thing I could just add to this is I used to keep, just to Lauren's point, I used to keep an exhaustive list of things that had screwed me over. And as a project person, that's like lessons learned, right? That's when you do your postmortem. But there were many, many, many times where I did something and it didn't work out, or I failed, or the project suffered for it, or I missed a step along the way. And I would keep this really exhaustive list of and I think it even was called that, things that had screwed me over. It was a Word document. It was giant. It was epic. I probably could have published it. But what I did as I evolved to more of a people leader, so not necessarily being the person on the ground at the project level anymore, but being the person who was coaching and working with my people who are now out in the field and having to be really resilient, is we used to keep a collective group. And I softened myself up a little bit as I was a people leader, and I didn't call it things that had screwed us over anymore, but I kind of tempered that a little bit and said, things that didn't work out for us, and what are we going to do about it? And we would keep this kind of collective consciousness between us that said, oh yeah, when Melanie did that didn't really work out for her. Can we help her out, or is there something else that we should do? And I think in the process of doing that, it made the people who are working for me realize that everything is not perfect all the time. And when people tell you things like, how can we move faster and how can we do this, you've got this really great reference point where you can go back and say, well, the last time that we did this didn't work. Maybe we can try this differently. And it opens up the conversation immediately for the idea that you're not perfect and everything that you're going to do isn't perfect, and you're allowed to make mistakes. And hey, guess what? I have 150 mistakes that my group made last year, but we've also learned from them, and we've also created a new world or an action where that's not going to happen again. So That's something that's been very valuable to me in my career as well.
No, I appreciate that. And that segues really nicely in terms of the style that you know and now feel confident in, and how to take that towards your team and make that leap. I'll open it up to any of the three of you, depending on who wants to jump in first. But when you kind of take those learnings from yourself, understanding who you are, confidence in how to approach conversations and how to be resilient for your own day, how do you then take, motivate, create, and engage your team to do much the same things? Whomever wants to jump in first, because I have 9 probing questions after that.
Yeah, I can jump in. I'll actually just something back to what Lauren was saying in her earlier comments about when you hire people. So one of the things that I do, it sort of sets the tone for the relationship of how you're going to work together. So Lauren was saying, you know, she always tells people she's a direct, and, you know, she doesn't want to hurt your feelings, but sometimes what she's saying is it's not intentional that way, but it could be received that way. One of the things that I do when I hire people is I set the stage for my honesty. So my honesty is something that has helped me a lot, but it's also caused me some issues too. Like I've had our CEO at AutoTrader tell me, thanking me for my honesty, and then calling it brutal and saying, that's brutal honesty, Sara, that you just gave me. And I didn't really need to know that. But one thing I do when I hire people is I set the stage for honesty, in the sense that I always ask them, how do you want to receive feedback? Because some people, I find most people will say, oh, I like to get direct feedback. And then when the moment comes for that direct feedback, they're not so keen on that anymore. And so I always ask this question in an interview, how do you want to receive feedback? And I guarantee you, I take my pen out and I'm going to write it down. I like to get direct feedback. I'm like, okay, cool. So I'm going to give you direct feedback because I'm making a note of it. And in 3 months' time, I'm going to pull that note out and say, Richard likes to get direct feedback. Awesome. Here it is. What are you going to do with it? Setting the stage in that moment has made it so easy for me to give people feedback, because all I've had to do is reference that point and say, you know what, right now we're going to have a high integrity conversation, and I'm going to give you some feedback, and we're going to be awkward for 5 minutes, and then we're going to get over it. And I think that sometimes when you want to build resilience in your team, you have to, you know, be the change you want to, like exhibit the behaviors you want to see. If I want to be a resilient person and I want my team to be resilient, I also have to demonstrate those actions of resiliency. I can't let a incident or bad performance go without a conversation, because what does that signal to the rest of the people on my team? If I'm letting one person get away with a bunch and I'm not letting someone else get away with anything, what does it signal to my people if I haven't done the job of making sure I've had that tough conversation? So yeah, right at the beginning of the relationship, build it in.
I feel like you inadvertently answered Sean's question that he posted around the theme of trust and transparency, and how does that reflect in building the relationship. I feel like, Sean, that's nail on head right there. But feel free to throw something else in the chat if you have other questions there. Lynn, Lauren, same question back to you.
Yeah, I'll kind of add on to what Sara was saying. One of the things that I had to do in terms of leading my team. So if anyone's familiar with the DISC model, so I'm a DC, so I'm all about get it done and get it right. That's all I care about. It's all about the task, which seems so inconsistent for being a people leader. But for me, getting it done and getting it right also means making sure we're taking the people into account, because that's my role. But it is a bit of my blind spot. And so I made sure I hired almost everybody on my team, you know, was very strong in sort of the INS. So they were all about people and relationships, which meant sometimes it was hard for me to give them what they needed. So it was always a balance of how do I stay true to who I am and my style, but recognize what they needed from me and at least try and do that. And so I was quite transparent about it. I would make jokes about, look, I'm not the type that's going to remember your birthday. I'm not going to think about these things. I'm so focused on the task that I'd go walking past my team, but I trained myself to look out of the corner of my eye and I would see one of the teammates and I would actually make a show of stopping, backing up, turn around saying, Lisa, what's going on right now? Like, I can tell there's something wrong. So I know it's probably been for 4 hours and I haven't noticed it. So I apologize. And she would laugh. And so help me understand what's going on and what do you need right now? And it wouldn't be a ton of time. And I think like Lauren, I'm not filled with natural empathy. I think we're quite similar from that. But, I do care very much about my team. And so, it is about owning what you have, being transparent about it, thinking and setting the stage right, but also looking for those opportunities where you can meet people where they are, right? And how to do that. I also think in terms of, I think the question around honesty and transparency, some of the strongest relationships I've built in organizations have started out with some of the most difficult people to work with in the organizations, the most challenging, and they often come from hitting a disagreement with them, realizing I was wrong, and having to walk into their office and say, I made a mistake there. You know what? You're right. Let's do it this way. And here's how I'm going to help you. And I find that also really leads to a high level of integrity and respect, because they also know now when I come in and say, no, I'm not changing my mind. This is the right decision and we're sticking to it. They know it's not just because I'm bullheaded and believe I'm always right. I will accept when I'm wrong. So I think, building relationships really requires that, even though the first time you go do it, it can be a bit terrifying, particularly if you're doing it with somebody that's, a higher level than you, and you've got to go in and admit you were wrong. And, what is it going to do to your reputation and your career? There's a lot of fear, but it actually works out in the end.
And Lauren, I promise we're going to get to you right next. Lynn, I think that's really interesting. Vlad just asked a question of when you need to bring a tough or unpopular decision to your team, how do you want to do that effectively? What's the most effective way to do that? And I think that's a really good example of, listen, this is the decision. It's tough, but that's what it's looking like. Any more advice there or comments?
I think the only other thing I would say, I used to use the line a lot with leaders in the organization. If we leave a gap, people will fill it with their own information. So it's one thing to tell people what we're going to do. We can't expect that they understand why. We need them to understand why we're doing this, particularly if it's going to have a hard impact on people. They need to understand it's not because we're blind to it or we don't care. But as Lauren said, we believe this is in the best interest of the company and of the organization moving forward. And so really trying to give that whole story, I think, is critical when you're delivering hard or what may be bad news.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank you.
Just to add on to that one thing, Lynn, I would say early in my career, I'm reading about Vlad's question now too, but early in my career, I absolutely have done this. I would have gone into my project team and said, oh my God, you guys, the VP just told me that they want this 5 weeks earlier. I know how crazy this is. What can we do about it? That would have been me 10 years ago. The me now would have gone into the team and said, I would have given them the business reason. I would have given them the hard reality of business revenue. I would have shared some metrics. I would have said, hey, sales are down. I would have given them any information that I was given to be fully transparent. I would have said, sales are down, revenue is down, customer account is down. I would have given them the business driver, but it also means that I had to ask for the business driver. I had to be resilient in that moment to say to the VP, why do you want this 5 weeks earlier? the 10 years ago version of me wouldn't have asked why. I would have just went, yeah, okay, I'll get it done. And I would have got it done, which is how I would have gotten bigger projects, because I would have found a way to get it done. But it's not right. I needed to have the courage to ask the senior VP to say, why do you want this 5 weeks earlier? You know how that's going to put pressure on the team. Please tell me the reason why so that I can sell it. And I think my approach now is I sell it. I sell it to the team and I ask them for suggestions of how we might actually achieve this. I know it's a stretch goal. Is it possible? Is it impossible? I don't go in now with that kind of senior leaders tell me this, therefore I will execute this. That's not the way to build team trust. That you can maybe do that once and then that team's not going to do anything for you anymore. So, but yeah.
No, appreciate that, Sarah. Lauren, bringing you into the mix on this, I think a lot has been said, and I think what's really interesting from yourself, given the understanding of self-management in our company and how, as a lead, that works and feels and is this constant balance of kind of the intersection of order and structure and allowing people to figure out the how on themselves. So kind of talk us through that evolution of how to build out that team, given how we are as a self-management company.
Yeah, it's different. In my other management roles, it was very easy to be like, it was my decision, right? Like how we did things, what we did, or more so, like there was still team involvement, but in the end, like my decision kind of trumped anything else that was coming up. And, you know, as someone who I think innately fears failure, I'm sure everyone does to some degree. I think I might fear it a little more than some people. You know, it's really hard to have, you know, at times quite a large team that you just have to kind of trust that they're going to make the right decisions. And I've struggled with, I think Vic asked a question in the chat around like letting things go wrong. And I've struggled with when I know someone on my team is making the wrong decision or what they're doing is going to cause a problem. Trying to have that conversation, giving feedback, talking through what could go right, what could go wrong, and then still giving them the space to make the decision and then holding them accountable when it goes wrong. So I think in the past probably year or so, I've gotten a lot better at that. It took a lot of letting go and almost not detaching a little bit, but accepting that, you know, though I am partially accountable for the failure because like it's one of my teams and something that at a higher level I'm responsible for. You know, failure's okay. And like, I'm going to address it and it's not going to happen again. And hopefully, you know, that person learned more by getting the opportunity to fail than me just course correcting them and then hoping they learned why I chose to course correct them. So that's been a struggle. But the other thing I think I do a lot now, being a remote lead to build resiliency within my team, is making sure like, you know, I have one-on-ones where we're constantly talking about the things that are going on and the things they're working on and what their thoughts are and how they're approaching things. And if they get into, you know, that negative space, like where they're maybe really upset about a decision that was made or something, like trying to empathize and like letting them vent and kind of being there on a personal level, but then very quickly like shifting to, okay, well, what can we do about it? Like, what's our next step? And not letting them hang in that space. I align with the ladies in that I would say I lean on transparency pretty heavily. I have a tag up with my team every day and I tell them the things I'm working on at the product management level, at the product and tech level. So I'm not 100% transparent, right? Like I'm not trying to freak anybody out, but I do tell them the things that are happening so that when, you know, a decision is made or something shifts, there is transparency there, and we go through, you know, it's not a shock. So those are kinds of things, especially as a remote leader where I can't see people, like, so I don't walk by them every day. I mean, literally no one on my team is in Charlotte. I think there's only 2 other people from product in our office at all. So I see them once a quarter before COVID, and now who knows when I'll see them again. So, you know, having those kind of constant tag ups and pinging them on Slack and doing different things, are, you know, making sure that I can check in different ways has become, you know, how I lead.
Perfect. Thank you, Lauren. I think that answered both Vic and Andrew's question around uncertainty and failure and resilience from that. But gentlemen, if that didn't answer that question, feel free to poke in the chat. I really like Dimfo's question, and I want to throw this out to all three of you. He asks, so we talk about failure as not being a bad thing and that we should embrace it and learn from it. At what point, or is there a point where too much failure becomes a concern? Interested on all three of your opinion on that one.
Oh, go ahead, Lynn.
Did you want to go in, Lauren? I've been jumping in too much. You go ahead. You take
fine. Yeah, I can kick it off. I think we as IQ are quite lucky in a lot of ways that I think we actually have a lot of space to fail safely. But I do think, Dimfo, you make a good point that like sometimes that also results in us as leads not knowing when it's too much failure. And one of the things I've been, you know, working really heavily on to kind of address that, because I've definitely felt that in the self-management culture of letting people make their own decisions, is getting really clear on what people's accountabilities are and asking, are they effectively fulfilling these things? Like, are they achieving this outcome? And then if they're not, so their failures are effectively like negating one of their accountabilities that we've defined, setting what my expectation is very explicitly, which I think sometimes at IQ we're not super good at, like documenting what the expectation is and putting a timeline on it and just being outrageously explicit about what I'm asking for. And then they either do it or they don't. And that's where, you know, when we talk about product failures and product failures being okay, like, hey, we thought building this thing was good, you know, and customers ended up not wanting it, like that's one thing. But if we're not doing the pre-work to validate it, or we're not doing, you know, other things that are part of our accountabilities, those are things we can control.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that idea of what do you have control over? Because mistakes are going to happen. To me, failure is too much when a person is making the same mistakes over and over again because they're using the same approach over and over again. So if somebody makes the same mistake 2 or 3 times, but they've tried to adjust to different approaches, I'm okay with that because they're trying to learn and adjust. And, you know, Sarah and I have a similar experience in that we were in an organization where failure really was not accepted. There was a talk about accepting failure. There was lip service to it in a lot of ways. But I, you know, not to be too critical of the organization, I also respect, you know, during that time, we were also in a fight for our corporate survival. So that was quite different in terms of, you know, if we made a big mistake, it could be the end of the company. I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but it actually was, because I saw the financials at some point, and that was the reality we were in. So for me as a leader, what I really needed to do was let go of some of the control that I like to have and the desire to have everything be right and correct and on time. Because if you don't give that up, if you don't allow people the opportunity to fail, then they're probably not developing. And they really need to learn by taking some of those risks. So.
Any last comments before we move on?
Yeah, I think failure has a place, but it shouldn't be the rule. Like I mean, Lynn's right. Like we worked in an organization where having things like saying failure is accepted was probably something someone read out of a Harvard Business Review article, and then an executive brought it to a table, but they didn't really mean it. Failure was not really optional. So it's why it's why I worked personally so hard on that, creating that space in my own team where it was really honest. It was a really honest space where nobody was scared to tell me they made a mistake, because really at the end of the day, it was my job to catch it early enough so that it didn't contribute to a larger scale failure. it wasn't like you could just go on and do your job every day and oh, sorry, I failed on that project. No big deal. I'll try better next time. I really had to create that safe space for my team to tell me when things were going off the rails early. And they had to know that they could trust me to like, it was like a safe room, right? Basically, you bring everything to me and then let me decide how to reframe it. I'll reframe it, or I will fix it, or I will bring people in to help fix this problem before this becomes a failure. And I don't believe that's wrong. Like I truly don't. I mean, I have been in an organization, like when I went from AutoTrader to work at Kitnace, which was it was like a very well-funded startup. Let's be clear. I mean, Chip Wilson's family funded that startup. So they had a lot of money to put into that. In some respects, it was amazing because you just had all of this freedom to like experiment, and they had a really audacious goal on revenue, but there was a freedom there to experiment. And it was so new for me because it felt like failure was, it felt like it was more like accepted, and I didn't have to work so hard to like fix everyone's mistakes. But after about a year, I remember thinking to myself, the resiliency is not here in the sense that people are not being critical enough of when this failure is happening. And it's just kind of almost cultural that it's okay and that we're encouraging it. But at the same time, I remember thinking to myself, as much as I sat in fear of failure at AutoTrader, I felt like if Kitnace had like even just like a little bit more of that going on in the culture, it might have been a different ending story. And no disrespect to either organization, these are all different styles and different drivers. But one thing I will say is that I've never had an issue or a problem in my day-to-day career when I've created a safe space for my own team to screw up, knowing that we're going to present a united front out to the rest of the organization.
Perfect. Appreciate that. One of the things that I was thinking about when that you were saying, Sarah, Trish Sale on her team, she calls those things niggling feelings. When it's like, we're going down a path, and if anybody has any niggling feelings right now, you got to let me know. And it's just kind of that like internal, I don't know what this is, but it doesn't feel right, and I just have to say it out loud. And so I just wanted to highlight that for any people on Trish's team, because that kind of ties back to that.
Every day you work, you get more of those. So so today, if you feel like you don't have the spidey sense or like the niggling feeling sense, tomorrow you'll have one. The next day you'll have more. And by the time you've been doing your job for 20 years, you'll be able to predict it. It's very good. That's a good term.
Perfect. So we talked a lot about I would need to be cognizant of time because you know me, I want to do this for 4 hours. So we talked about the kind of the personal resilience. We talked about as a team lead, how you build that on your team. It's now, hey, not only as a team lead, but just as a colleague and as an individual here, how do we take that and help build that within the organization itself? So let's kind of with a lens take this both as a team lead, but also just as a peer. So when we kind of shift into that line of questions, I actually wanted to use part of Vlad's question here to prompt. How do you approach handle work-related issues between your team members and still having them be a productive team? So again, this could be not only on your team, but kind of team to team as well. Talk me through how to build that within teams. Sorry, any three of you. Anyone that wants to jump in.
Yeah, cut me off if I'm going the wrong direction on this, but in terms of bringing groups and teams together, one of the things I always do is try and center everyone, even if it's within my team, and particularly if it's cross teams, center everybody on what the purpose is, right, and what the goal is. I've worked with some teams where we have, one team may have more ego than the other, or may have more, in our organization, some teams had more power than another. And so really being clear on, what was it that was bringing us together? What was the project? What was the outcome we wanted? What were, why were we all in the room? I mean, we were all there for a reason. If one team could have just done it on their own, they wouldn't have called my team in. So being clear on what we all had to contribute and what the outcome we wanted, that way we could kind of short circuit if there were people that, you know, maybe didn't get along or had different working styles. So, you know, it's not about, you don't have to like each other, but we have to work together to get this outcome for the business. And here's the benefit for everybody. And then just keeping people focused on what that purpose and what that outcome was.
No, that's perfect. And Lauren, I'm curious if you can jump in here, especially from a self-management perspective internally, and how cross collaboration is such a big deal and a key to our everyday here at IQ. Curious if you can also comment on that.
Yeah, if I cut off your video froze, which sometimes is an indicator I'm going to lose internet. So if I cut off, just continue without me. I'll be back eventually. Yeah. Well, I think there's kind of two things. So one, you know, Lynn made an interesting comment of like, you don't need to like each other. I think what's interesting at IQ, at least from my experience, is that we as a company tend to prioritize a little bit higher liking each other than maybe some other companies. And I do think it's why some people end up finding that IQ is not the right place for them, because personal relationships are a lot more important here than maybe some other companies. So, and I know I've personally struggled with that because I tend to be very about the work. So I wanted to just call that out. And then I think with self-management, you know, inter-team working, I think it just comes kind of back to the same thing as like individual, like setting accountabilities. It's just being really clear about the purpose for each team and how they can work together. I think products had some really cool examples of this recently, where we're kind of refocusing on some very specific product goals. Like we kind of narrowed it down to like 4 things, as opposed to every team working in isolation. And it's been really cool to see people coming together and taking on things that maybe aren't like their normal role, but just getting the work done that needs to get done. And the things I'd say about the success there are being clear about, you know, what each team's role is and what their purpose is, but then also just be open to, we as a company are constantly shifting. And if anyone here has not experienced it yet, it's because you haven't been here long enough. Just give it a little while. And you just have to be open to just raising your hand and saying, hey, this isn't working, or here's the clarity that I need, and just asking for it, because nobody is going out of their way to like make your job difficult or do something that you think you should be doing, like stepping on your toes. Like it's just, everyone's just cares so much about the success of the company that, you know, they're just trying to pitch in. So if you need something or something's not clear, just ask. And everyone will like be like, oh, I didn't realize that was a concern. Like, let's tackle it. And that's been my experience, that if you say it, like people will, so just don't stay silent, because people will care and plug in.
Sarah, you haven't had the opportunity to pitch in on this one yet.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of these ladies have said. I basically, you know, I've led a lot of cross-functional teams, a lot of teams with a lot of different people in terms of skill level, personality styles, function in the organization. And I think the most important thing is to understand what everybody brings to the table. And also a good project lead or a good lead looks like someone who gives air to everybody as well. And in the moment where you find one group of people is dominating a conversation, or, you know, everything that someone else says gets a big fat no responded to it, or you feel people are interrupting each other, you kind of have to sort of like take control of it and recognize that everybody has brought something to the table and you're there for a reason. Like Lynn said, if one department could nail it, why is everyone sitting around the table? So we know that's not true. We know that one department can't nail it, that everybody has to be there working together. And a good person leading the team will be the person that allows everybody a little bit of intellectual air at the table. Don't let somebody become a vacuum for all the air.
Yeah, if I can just jump in, the other thing I really loved about what Lauren said there was, and I think this is often undervalued, is the importance of having the courage to ask questions. So to ask questions either because you don't know either what's expected of you or what's expected of the project, but also, I mean, I've been in executive meetings where we're talking about large scale business strategies in areas that I have no expertise or authority, and I developed a thick skin because I had a choice. I can either sit there like a lump and be adding nothing of value, or I could try and find a way to add value. And so the value I could add was, I called it, I'm the one that's going to ask the stupid questions. I'm going to ask the stupid questions and everyone's going to look at me like I'm a little bit crazy. But what I learned, after a couple of times of doing that was, the first few times I did it was just so that I could learn more and maybe not feel like I was as stupid at the table. But, what happened was I would ask a stupid question and a couple of times people would go, oh, we actually hadn't thought about it in this way. And it would lead to another question. It would lead to something else. And we'd pivot the strategy just slightly. And it would end up adding to its success. And so, it wasn't I was contributing knowledge to it. I had just asked a question, thinking about it from the perspective of the customer. So, again, that courage to really ask questions and know that you can add value just through that, and get comfortable with the initial discomfort.
I love that. Anybody that knows me, my go-to is always, I have a stupid question. So I was sitting here, I'm like, oh God, I'm not the only one that does that, thank goodness. There are some really good questions asked in here. And so if we don't get them answered, I'm going to email them out to you and then we'll get responses back anyways. Mostly because we have 16 minutes left and a really good ending question. Sarah, one of the things that you had mentioned last week when we were talking was you had just kind of gotten off of another kind of learning workshop, and one of the things that you learned was how to be a lantern. And so I want to first ask you to kind of describe what that means, and then wanted to get some pulse from both Lynn and Lauren on that as well.
Yeah, so one of the first conversations that we had preparing for this, it was on Juneteenth, and our company had done a full day of programming for Juneteenth, and I got to be part of some amazing discussions that day. And one of the concepts that I was left with was the idea that someone can be a lantern for change in your space. So it requires courage, and it requires a little bit of vulnerability. And the idea is that when you are a lantern for a group of people, maybe an underrepresented group, or maybe just somebody who's not pushed full into the table, but sitting a little bit back from the table still, you can become that person and share your privilege with the group of people that you're around, to get them some airtime. So, or to get the kind of concept of change a little bit brighter, hence the term lantern. So, one of the examples I wanted to give about this was in a space where, and it's a little bit of like a question that we had earlier too about allowing people some space at a table. One of the things I wanted to say was that when you're in a group of people and you've got kind of somebody hijacking ideas in a meeting or interrupting, or maybe you've got some people who don't speak up, and when they do speak up, they get either told they're wrong, or they get kind of talked over. I've seen it a lot with women sitting at a table full of salesmen, or just a lot of more aggressive, maybe senior leaders. I've seen it a little bit where you've got, a woman sort of puts an idea out at the table, maybe gets interrupted, certainly doesn't get acknowledged, and then 20 minutes later in the meeting, somebody's hijacked that idea as their own. And one of the things that I've been very conscious of in my facilitation or in my leadership is that I'll often call the table back to the original commentator. So I will say something like, hey, you know what? I'm really glad that you picked up on what Lynn said earlier. I will gently bring the attention back to the fact that Lynn will have said that first and her idea was hijacked. And it does a couple things in that moment. I haven't called anybody out. I've just gently brought the attention back to the idea that that you kind of stole the thunder of somebody else, and it's bad behavior, first of all. And it's something that once you've redirected everybody once, you generally don't have to do it too many times more for it to sink in what was actually happening in that moment. And for me, that's my own personal lantern. That is the lantern that I can carry with me, is that I have a way of, it's not calling out, it's like calling in. It's sort of saying, I'm not going to shame you in front of all of these people, but I'm going to redirect. I'm going to make sure that behavior isn't something that gets to continue. And for me, that's sort of the concept of being a lantern.
Lynn, do you want to comment next on that, and then we'll end with Lauren?
Sure. I was thinking about this question, and I actually was sitting in on another kind of webinar session the other day, and I thought I would share this concept that was brought up by a guy named Paul Gibbons, who runs one of the local search agencies, and he was giving a talk to a bunch of CEOs about how to attract and hire high performers. So I think one of the things about being a lantern is also, I think a lot of people struggle to know, what does that look like? What should I count as important? And it's certainly dependent upon the culture of the organization you're in. But one of these things that Paul talked about was, through all his work placing leaders in organizations, is he said they look for 4 traits. They found there's 4 traits that high performers have in common. The first is integrity. So integrity of self and integrity in your actions, which I think is absolutely critical. If it allows you to have resiliency because you're so true to who you are and you're true to the organization. The second was an ability to get things done. So if you prove you can deliver and you deliver for the organization, that will be rewarded. You'll be given space, and you can then use that space to bring others with you. The third was low drama. So I always chuckle when I think of some of the more challenging people, Sara and I worked with. They were brilliant, but they brought so much drama with them to the organization, it actually outweighed the value. So, when you look at the impact you have in meetings and with your peers, if you realize that you're actually attracting some drama, it's something to consider. Are you at times acting to your interest or the interest of the organization? And the last was passion. And it's kind of interesting that low drama and passion are 2 of the characteristics. Passion is really about, are you showing that you care, right? Does that really come off in terms of what you do? So I think, particularly for those here that are interested in becoming a leader and trying to figure out what that model is that you want to aspire to, I would encourage you to think about those 4 traits. And I think if you can develop the skills around those, it'll serve you well.
Thanks, Lynn. Lauren, lantern. Go. Shine that light.
Yeah, I think the thing that resonated with me when we were talking through this was, one of the things I believe pretty strongly in is, as you become a leader and rise through leadership up, it almost puts more emphasis on you really being that guide. And even if we talked about earlier, do you go out and say, oh, this strategy just came from the top down, right? And I believe really strongly that if I, as a lead of product and tech, right, which is one of the largest parts of IQ, not the only lead, right, but one of them, am going out and just being well, Ken told me we have to do this, so we're doing it. That's not going to inspire many people, and it's actually going to result in the company failing, from my perspective. And that may not be true. Maybe people will be resilient without me. But I believe that if my role is to question the things that I don't necessarily agree with, or raise questions that have come up and see if the strategy should shift. But if the decision has been made, like this is the strategy, like this is what we're going with, to advocate for that and help people get behind it and be there for them and hear their concerns. But always, again, I was talking about before, like bring them back to, well, what can we do? And really just being there for people and you know, hearing people, but again, always just bringing it back to that positivity. So that's what resonated with me with being a lantern at IQ.
Appreciate that. We have 7.5 minutes, and Andrew asked a phenomenal question. So I feel like maybe we'll use this as the last one and then share our goodbyes. Andrew asks, what are the warning signs you look for to notice lack of resiliency? So this could be on your own team or just a colleague. Throw out some quick warning signs for lack of resiliency.
I can kick this one off. Lack of resiliency, one of the main signs for me is when people stop showing up to non-mandatory meetings, like your team tag-ups or stand-ups if you're a dev team, if they're just disengaged. And then also if you've noticed someone, like normally they'll maybe be a little, when they're frustrated, be a little negative, but you can pull them out. When you start seeing like you just can't pull them out, like you're trying to like shift it to something positive and they're just going right back to negative like really quick. Those to me are warning signs of like something is wrong. And that could be a personal thing, right? Like it could have nothing to do with work, but they're not in a space, they're either burnt out, like they're just not in a space to pull themselves out and be resilient.
Good one. Lynn, you're off mute, so I'm going to put
yeah. Good eye. I would say for me, I think one of the signs is when people aren't owning their own role, particularly when things are going bad. I have very little patience for somebody on my team who is always looking for somebody else to blame. You know, I prefer something's going wrong. I want to see everybody in the team going in, trying to help, trying to fix. And, you know, we can talk later about, you know, how it went wrong. Right now, we just need to fix it. So for me, that's the big one. You know, are they stepping up and owning their piece, and even sometimes being willing to own other people's pieces and contribute? That shows me they just don't have the resiliency we need to be successful.
Sarah?
Okay, so I'll try and tackle the company side of this, in the sense that what does it look like when a company is starting to lose resilience? I actually teach part-time studies in a strategic management role, and it's very much like a product mindset when you're doing strategy. And one of the signs that we talk about in terms of companies losing resilience is when they fall back to old patterns. So you stop pushing the needle for the customer, you stop thinking about the customer, and you start falling back into old habits. So like what's worked for you in the past. And certainly I bet you there's been a lot of companies in the last 6 months, or certainly last 3 months, who have dealing with COVID. The requirement of our world right now, what's happening in our world right now, requires future thinking. It requires resiliency like you've never experienced before. You have to be kind of pushing the boundaries on your product, pushing the boundaries on understanding who your customer is and knowing what their problems are that you're trying to solve. And I think one of the early, like the kind of test for me right now would be, do I have a room full of executives right now who are falling back to their old ways, to their old patterns, to the things that they knew before? Are they all a bunch of hammers looking for nails? I think that to me would be, if I was sitting at IQ and all of a sudden we were backpedaling and questioning our really, really pioneering thoughts, if I was going back to, yeah, but this worked for us last year, like I sold this package last year and it worked out for us, we should do it again. I would say that would be my sign of my company is losing a little bit of resiliency to compete.
Very well said. Perfect. Well, a great hour and a half. Sarah, Lynn, Lauren, thank you so much for your time on this panel. I know there's 4 or 5 questions that were asked that we didn't get to, so I'll email them out to the 3 of you, and we'll look to get a quick couple notes back, and we'll post it in the Leads channel, everybody. But please kind of everybody give them a little shout or a little reaction clap. Thank you for spending the time. We really appreciate it. So hopefully that helped everybody and gave you some different perspectives. And I know I think we're rolling into a break then with 1 session in the afternoon. So enjoy your break, hit the bathroom, grab a sandwich, 1 more down, and then the weekend.
Excellent. Thank you all. Take care. Have a good weekend.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your time. Bye-bye.
Bye.